Mach 3, give me crew show on 2, 3, and 4.
Line 1, actually 1.
6, 3. Mach 3, give me start line 2.
5 electric. Mach 3. Line 2, Mach 9.
Mach 3, give me start line 1 and crew show on 7 and 9.
Line 1, crew show 7 and 9, Mach 9.
Yeah, do something. I hate weapons.
Super Ops, line 3, Reservoir Avionics.
Super Ops. Line 4 is code 3 for engine vibe.
Fuck. Hey, so I started a Patreon because frankly, this stuff's getting expensive. Nothing will change the podcast or the blog if you don't subscribe, but if you want early access to episodes, monthly AMAs, episode shoutouts, voting on podcast topics, and all kinds of 20 Years Done gear, head over to patreon.com/20yearsdone. This month's top tier Patreon shoutout goes to Robbie Walker, Travis Barnes, Kevin Traw, JT Owens, Delinda Baker, and Matt Jones. Thanks for the support. I think this is an important topic because it speaks to cultural issues in the military. However, it's also a sensitive subject. As such, there'll be strong language both in profanity, which is standard here, but also in the subject itself. Try to keep an open mind. Okay, so today we're joined by our frequent guest, Lieutenant Colonel retired Kevin Traw, who was my squadron commander in the early 2000s. Has been on probably, 6 or 7 episodes now, Kevin?
I think this will be number 7.
Yep. So he's my go-to whenever I want to get a peek behind the curtain of command / like senior officer leadership sort of theory and stuff. And that's what we're going to talk about today, which is military morality and how it's addressed in units. So do you want to give a quick background for those that have never heard you, Kevin?
Yeah, so spent 20 years on active duty from 93 to 2014. All in aircraft maintenance except for a 3-year career broadening tour where I worked on global position satellite systems. The vast majority of my field time was flight line maintenance, all in the F-16. So I spent very little back. It was a maintenance. I spent time at MXS, which would have been engines and munitions. So it would have been EMS, CMS. But the rest of the time was on flight line. Half of it was in the objective wing, and then half was in the new structure, I guess, where they're going to change again. So they'll release the structure at the end of my career. And then I spent a few times on staff at the air staff, the NATO staff in Mons, Belgium, and the USAFE staff, in addition to my time in career broadening on global positioning satellite system. And then now I've been retired for 7 years, and I'm an executive at a healthcare company.
Okay. So kind of the focus is going to be in this episode, your time as a commander, which I think you did one stint as a commander, correct?
Yeah, it was unusual. I only did one stint, went right to an AMXS, which was kind of, it was a little bit unusual, right? To do a single AMXS. So yeah, so after that, I followed that with the Pentagon, because once you kind of done an AMXS, at least my group commander's opinion was, what else are you going to learn as a squadron commander?
Right. Okay, so in episode 24, that's when we kind of worked through recovering from adverse actions. The episode before it was with Colonel retired Vic Mora, where he talked about what an adverse action was, kind of how it happens, and then his advice on recovering from it, whereas yours was more focused on the recovering. But you kind of talked about somebody that worked for you that got into some trouble with dating someone that was his subordinate, right?
Correct, yes.
And you also kind of mentioned that his wife was like frustrated at what was going on with them, right?
Right. She was. In fact, during the middle of it, she was outside my office and wanted to see me and wanted to know, why I'd put her husband at Luke at the time had a correctional custody, which is what I had put him in. And the first sergeants wouldn't let her in, of course. But, the key thing is that while the military judicial system cares about, I'll say, everything, they don't share specific disciplinary actions tied to a name, to a spouse, right? I guess a court proceeding would, right, as part of that, but non-judicial punishment doesn't have that. So he had not told his wife why he was in trouble, so she had no idea. And because what he was in trouble for was, in violation of, one of the kind of morality, which we're going to talk today. It wasn't like he had, violated TO. He would have probably told his wife, well, I violated TO, but I wouldn't have put someone in correctional custody for violating a TO.
Yeah. And that's interesting too, because in episode 24, I think it was 24, we really walked through how hard it must be for a husband to go to a wife and basically tell them that they had done something wrong at work, and now the family unit was going to suffer short-term financial, long-term financial. So there's like a lot of shame, especially as a parent, either a man or a woman, going to their spouse and kids. Like, they don't know. They probably wouldn't be able to understand all the nuance of how you came to that incorrect decision, all the influences, cultural, environmental and stuff, but also admitting it. But it's a really different beast in that situation, because this was an individual that had been unfaithful to his wife, engaging in a relationship with a subordinate, which was inappropriate, right?
Correct.
But I really want to ask, did you charge him with adultery?
We did. That was one of so I had two cases of this when I was a squad commander. He would charge with adultery because we literally caught him in the act,
mm-hmm.
right at her dorm room.
Mm-hmm.
I had someone else who was committing adultery, and we did the classic, no contact order,
mm-hmm.
which then he went and violated no contact order, because no contact order, I guess theoretically they have the same burden of proof, but it's easier to find someone having no contact order because you can have, I think he had sent her a text or an email, and that's how it was. So yeah, so he was the one that we were talking about with the subordinate. We charged him with adultery amongst other things.
Yep. So today we're going to talk about adultery in the military, fraternization in the military, unprofessional relationships. And that's a bit of like a triad a little bit, because a lot of times there's elements of each interspersed. And I think we're briefly going to touch on Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and some of the UCMJ articles that relate to that. So I guess my first question is, how is adultery different from a boyfriend and a girlfriend that are unfaithful in a unit, as far as the military is concerned?
Well, as military is concerned, right, that because someone is married, then they can be charged, under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. If it's a boyfriend or girlfriend, I'll say the military takes a neutral stance.
Okay,
right?
So
not broad at all.
I guess, how does me cheating on my wife impact my unit's readiness, capabilities, leadership? I mean, am I seen as I'm immoral or disloyal or dishonest if I have relationships with someone besides my wife?
I think the answer is no. It doesn't impact those things from a unit perspective. The Air Force, of course, and the other services too, they do view that as something that would have an impact. I think from a practical perspective, again, taking out the subordinate superior one off the table, it's going into an area that probably the military does not need to be in. And I actually believe the reason they're interested in is less about the good order and discipline, and they want to portray a certain view to the general public. And that view of the general public may in fact be positive, but that does not mean you should necessarily use a military readiness rationale as a reason for an image construct.
It seems like that image to the public, for whatever reason, the military is hyper focused on the marriage piece. Because when we talk an image to the public, let's go back to World War II. When you think of sailors coming into port, what do you think of? You think of a bunch of sailors going out and going to bars and having a good time, dressed in their whites, and then they're also looking for companionship. Like, that's not an altogether unfair perception of any overseas deployment service, TDY, or anything like that. A lot of times there's people looking to relax and they go into port. And besides the prostitution, which there certainly is a UCMJ article, solicitation, you're talking about just engaging in, relationships, albeit brief. But I've never heard the military go, okay, you can go into port, but you can't have sex with anybody. I mean, besides like General Order Number 1 in deployment or something, right?
Right. And I think that I would even say that mentality is almost celebrated, at least in military lore or culture, right? I'm going to take the infidelity one off, right? Just going into port and having good, having people enjoy this. I do think, again, we're not going to talk about prostitution, I think, because of, the human trafficking element. I think that's become a lot more relevant to that in the last maybe 15 to 20 years. And whether wherever your view is on prostitution, how people end up to it, there's a large component of human trafficking, which, I can definitely see why the military and the U.S. government would try to, look at that differently. But certainly amongst consenting, non-coerced adults, the military doesn't care. And again, like I said, they even in some ways, celebrate that culture, which is because, they pull into port, right? I mean, when you pull into Hong Kong or Singapore or Japan, or even if you're doing the Fleet Week, they want them to go out and be amongst the people. Now they don't want them getting in fights and things like that, because I think that, that was maybe part of the older culture. They do want them to have a good time. So yeah, you could argue there's a bit of a duplicity in that, because you could see how a 21 or 22 or 23-year-old could get confused about why this behavior was for sure tolerated, maybe even celebrated, to go into where now it can be a disciplinary, career-ending kind of circumstance.
Okay, so
once you're married.
What if a married couple, we'll do husband and wife for this, because we're going to talk the don't ask, don't tell stuff later. Let's say a husband and wife, while they were dating, they had an open relationship. They had long-term girlfriends or boyfriends that kind of intermingled, maybe even roommates or whatever. And then that works for them. And then they get married and they agree in their marital contract, their marital bed, and all the other, sacrosanct sort of marital institutions, that they had no restrictions on who they could date. They could date whoever they wanted. And that is what they've agreed to. But the military now supersedes what they've agreed to.
Correct.
The adultery in the UCMJ. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Now, and people could say, well, does the military go after adultery that often? I think the fact of the matter is it is a cloud that hangs over people's head, right? You always have it there. So is it, what good order and discipline is it, is that necessity to have that rule? So absolutely, the military, whether the person or the couple in your example cared or not, the military absolutely could take action if they so choose on that. And given that it's an open, in the scenario you gave, more open relationship, it very well could be heard about. Right. And then the thing is, it'd be up to somewhat to that discretion of the commander, but then commanders worry about, what if I knowingly know this is going on because it's against the rules, and I allow that to occur, they could take action on that, even if they think it doesn't impact good order discipline. If I don't take action on that, then something else happens. Someone can say, well, why are you picking and choosing of what to follow in the UCMJ, right? So you bind people who maybe were getting in morality on certain circumstances, and you're forcing action in that area because the commanders want the latitude to take action in other areas and don't want to be seen as being inconsistent.
Yeah, you talked about that a lot, that in your career you kind of focused on consistency, and it's a good point. If you know a open relationship, we'll say infidelity, but I would argue if you have an open relationship, infidelity, as long as you're operating within the rules you've agreed to with your spouse, it's not really unfaithful per se. But let's say the commander knows of infidelity and he doesn't take action. Wouldn't that bar him from any adultery prosecution or actions in his unit, especially if everybody knew? If
he used the mantra of consistency, yes, because
it would appear to be favoritism, right?
Right, because UCMJ doesn't say if someone's in an open relationship, right? It just says this is the rule. So yeah, absolutely, I think it would effectively bar them from doing that, right? And again, if there was a subordinate supervisor relationship, you could use other tools, right? Mm-hmm. But I think effectively it would bar a commander from doing that.
But I certainly suspect that if it was real adultery and that that information, that drama had bled over into the professional environment, be it his wife came in and made a big scene in the unit, or she was texting all the time or calling all the time or calling the shirt or calling the commander. I'm sure these are not unusual scenarios that I'm describing, right?
No, that happens. I think
Right.
that you could probably argue it becomes disruptive because we have those rules on the book,
But
right?
wouldn't that all be captured by good order, a general good order and discipline?
It would be. But
So
the
why
thing
do I
is,
need the adultery for?
you probably don't. And
Okay.
anyways, because we have those, I think sometimes that's why spouses are coming in, right? And they
Mm.
know there's rules on the so that
The
I
more
think
noise they
sometimes
make, the more punishment.
right.
happens.
So you could argue that having that rule in place may actually then cause the breakdown of good order and discipline, right? Because they're calling the shirt, they're calling their
Right.
friends, they're
If that
texting
didn't
friends.
happen, they may not be coming in and making a.
If there was no rule against it, it's, I would say, much less likely, because again, in the private sector, if a spouse called in, you wouldn't even care, right? Again, we're putting the morality, good person, bad person kind of to the side, right? We're simply talking the rules. It would be of no consequence, right? So no one in a private sector role is going to call in for that. So there is going to be no breakdown in the work structure.
Yeah, and you've been in the private sector for 7 years now, and you were in the military for 21 years. How does adultery affect, like, so if the argument is adultery, so I guess I'm having trouble understanding why adultery matters to the military. So is it an image thing? Not necessarily, because you can date and cheat all you want without any professional repercussions as long as you're not married. You can go to port and engage in lots of consensual sexual relationships, and it's stereotypical of a lot of branches of service under certain situations. So clearly, engaging in sexual acts is not the image that the military is concerned about. It seems like the military might be concerned about breaking your word to your spouse or something, that the nuclear family or something. But again, if you and your spouse have agreed that this is that the agreement you've reached is open and consensual to promiscuity or whatever, I guess I'm struggling to understand why the military has any adult. And again, if there's no one coming into work and causing a disruption, I still don't understand why the military would weigh in on adultery ever.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, I think it is an image issue, right? Obviously, there's no, discussion about why certain things are in there. I mean, some are painfully obvious why they're in there. I think it comes down to an image, right? And I think what the image they're trying to portray is a nuclear unit,
Mm-hmm.
right? That this is, we're setting this kind of standard. We want to hold our people to a higher standard, though, as you just pointed out, if people are single and out having a good time, that can get carried away too, right? There does not seem to be an issue with that, right? Certainly does not seem to be an issue.
Because it seems like during a deployment, they have that general order because they're trying to prevent. Obviously, it's a much tighter unit, so you have a lot more chances for unprofessional relationships, and then also there's the distinct risk that someone might become pregnant, and now you're going to lose. You're going to have to logistically get that person out, maybe replace them, lose a body, and it's like you need all hands on deck. And also, you want to be focused on what you're doing and not be distracted by all these things.
Right.
So those are clearly like very controlled mission. Like, this will affect the mission if this gets out of hand. And obviously, it still happens on deployment, but it's muted a little bit by how tightly controlled it is. But here's my question: what if you came back stateside and a commander tried to issue an order that you are not allowed to engage in sex for the next 6 months while you're at, Oklahoma City or whatever? What would that?
It would. Yeah, I mean, it would. It wouldn't last a day, right? Because there's one, there's no authority to it, and two, they would say you'd have to prove how does it impact good order discipline, right? Which, to your point, is that the infidelity, the disruption in the units oftentimes is because the spouse is calling in because they know this could get the person in trouble, right? That causes the issue.
Adultery also, I just want to jump in real quick. Adultery also creates a very weird power dynamic, because if you're a military to civilian couple, only one of you is bound by the UCMJ.
It's fine. I was going to say that, right? You could only one person is bound, and obviously, if a spouse, the civilian spouse is having adultery, they're not going to be banned from base for that, right? I mean, you can be banned from base, but it's not going to be for that at all, right? So you're right. It's an imbalance because the military person can get in trouble for a whole litany of things that the civilian, and I would tell you, when we would have issues in the unit that involved say a negative dynamic between the spouse civilian, spouse military, whether it was infidelity involved or not, we would also always tell the person, like, be careful.
Yep.
Right? That there are things that you can be held accountable for that your spouse cannot be, right? Because you have to remind them, right?
Mm-hmm.
That, it is. I've never thought of it that way. I mean, you certainly would tell them that, but I never thought of it in the power dynamic that you just described. Mm-hmm. We certainly would caution people right around that, because I think that they would feel like, well, if they have one misstep, they could get in trouble. But their spouse had a misstep, their work literally wouldn't care.
Yep. And then also just the whole dynamic of if you're the military member and your spouse is not, and your spouse cheats, now, for me, that would bar, sexual sort of interactions with them anymore, because the emotional wound, we're assuming not an open relationship, there's like,
right.
Actual infidelity, never mind the fact that I don't know who they've had sex with. So now there's like a medical, like, I want to protect myself from anything they've kind of been exposed to. But now you're barred until whatever this process is finalized. And in some states, you have to live separately for a year before you can get divorced. And you're living in separate locations while they're going out and they're dating and they're having a good time and are doing all these things. And you are completely bound, or you're prevented from building new relationships.
And your scenario given isn't a hypothetical. That absolutely happens, right? And that's, again, one of those things of, even if you have legal separation but not divorce, right? I mean, I think the general rule is, if you're legally separated, the military is not going to take action. I don't know that it's officially written that way, right? But certainly, you're right that they could be totally separate, and the military person could be held accountable when they're in a situation, not living together, not involved with each other, and they can be held accountable for infidelity, even though they're separated.
Okay, so here's what I'll ask you. There is a UCMJ article that bars adultery, right?
Correct.
So clearly, because it's against the UCMJ, there is very little adultery in the military, right?
Yeah, I don't believe the UCMJ rule lowers the adultery rate in the military. Yeah. The military adultery rate is whatever it is, probably based on the same factors in the civilian world, right? If you argue that, when people are TDY provides more opportunity than the civilian world because you're gone for longer. But that's a dynamic of, you can have someone who travels all the time in that scenario. But yeah, it's, absolutely, the rule, in my opinion, would have zero impact. There's other factors at play that and again, I don't know if anyone's ever done a study on infidelity in the military. Certainly, I think I've read that, the divorce rate is higher in the military. I would be pretty confident it's not due to infidelity. If there's infidelity, the underlying symptom is not the infidelity, right? So, So divorce rate, I think I did read a few years ago, it was higher in the military, and my guess is from what you've talked about in other episodes, strain and stress and everything that goes along with the job, which could lead potentially to infidelity.
Yep. Okay. So, we're going to shift. And also, it's important to know, I'm not like advocating for people to be unfaithful to their spouses. I just think the military should not be involved. And also, like, I think the application of adultery as a UCMJ action is really wildly different based on the supervisor, commander, unit circumstances, that it creates these bizarre outcomes. I knew a gentleman who was married mill to mill, and his wife cheated on him with multiple air crew. She was enlisted, and she told him he was deployed. She was at home. She had inappropriate relationships with a bunch of guys that were around the base, and she told him when he came back, and he couldn't believe it, and it crushed him. And then he went back to her and asked, "Hey, can you tell me again and who it was?" She's like, "That's weird, but okay." And she told him. He recorded all of it, gave it to her supervisor. Her supervisor's like, "I really don't know what you want me to do with this." He's like, "Well, she's cheating on me, and like that's a UCMJ thing." And she got a LOR from her supervisor. And the same day she got an LOR from her supervisor, he was out changing a tire on a jet, and he had lifted his safety glasses up briefly to try to get the safety wire in the hole for the hubcap. QA came along, saw him, and he got an LOR. And he was so just enraged that the same disciplinary outcome was for both of them for things that he viewed just to be totally out of whack.
Yeah, and of course, a totally different episode would be on the difference in disciplinary between, say, maintenance and other career fields.
Yep.
Right. That doesn't surprise me because she was in the ops career field. This is not a ops bad, maintenance good, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maintenance, especially on the flight line, for whatever reason, has a different standard. And that doesn't seem, and of course, I would say certainly supervisors do handle things that are violation of UCMJ. I would say adultery, that should be the commander. The commander should make the choice either to or not to do something. I don't think that should be, left at a supervisor level.
And in fairness, in the context of this conversation, I would advocate that nothing should happen to her because I think the adultery shouldn't be in the UCMJ.
Sure.
But,
right.
Okay, so let's move on to fraternization. So fraternization is where an officer engages in a personal relationship with an enlisted person where they're kind of seen as equals peers in that personal relationship. Like if you're at work and, like there was many times I was a senior NCO and I had a young lieutenant that was working with me where I was almost in a mentor-mentee sort of relationship, but that was very specific to a professional environment.
Right.
And there was not an equal footing sort of thing outside the work center. But my question is, I guess, because enlisted and officers, they can get married, right?
They can. And actually, in our squadron, our first section commander, she had been enlisted. And I think her husband was a weapons troop. Wasn't in our squadron, right? They especially as a section commander, right? They had to have her separate. He may have been in MOS, I believe is where it was at, right? So it had happened. Now they were, I think, especially in the era that when you and I got to know each other, when they were trying to, expand the force, so they had a fair number of people become an enlisted officer. That was not uncommon, right? When I was younger, that was a really rare, right? Scenario. Usually it was like a guard active duty, reserve active duty relationship. I saw it more later on. And it was very interesting because certainly there was people who had evidently dated. They couldn't get caught dating. Once they were married, they were completely legal,
right?
From UCMJ, which is interesting because you have to say, well, how did they get married? They just one day said, let's get married, right? So obviously there's a backstory, right? So it's kind of interesting that you can take a blind eye to that piece, right? Because now they're married, which that one kind of always seemed interesting to me because what had to happen. So, but once they're married, they were fine. Unless, again, they had to be separated in terms of units and all that, but that's just normal good order discipline.
So you're saying that, let's say I'm a staff sergeant and there's a lieutenant in my unit and we never date, we never hang out outside work. And I go up and I propose to them and they say yes. And then we immediately go that day and we get married, even though we're in the same unit. And then one of us would have to be moved and the Air Force would go, that's fine. That makes perfect sense. That's okay by the rules.
Yes. As I understood it. And that's
the stupidest fucking thing I've ever heard in my entire life.
It's a little silly, right? Cause they're they obviously, the scenario you gave wouldn't have ever occurred. There was obviously a backstory to it. But
sure.
Again, I actually had someone, like I said, in our unit who was the scenario of, it was they'd both been active duty and she got commissioned. So when they just had to be in different units. So yeah, it was very interesting on how that works. So what's even funnier is I try to not only explain it to civilians, which is a little bit difficult. You have to explain the whole officer enlisted, but when I was my last assignment, I was in NATO, and we were, every day we went to coffee, and we would talk just random stuff like you would in our own units, right? And I don't know how it came up, but they were talking about enlisted officer, and I remember it was a German lieutenant colonel. He goes, "You can't date and get married." We're like, "Well, you can't date, right? If you just get married, I guess you're okay." He goes, "But what if you love them? Like when I said, you better not get caught, right? At all." I said, I said, absolutely. Unlike maybe the infidelity, which we just talked about, where people would potentially turn a blind eye or not go after it based on their views. I find it hard to believe if any commander, if they found an officer dating enlisted, would not have taken action. Right. I really do believe that would have been a rare circumstance.
Who do you think they would have taken? Who do you think they would have taken action against?
It should be the officer.
It should be the officer. Okay.
Should be the officer.
So, all right. So
what we didn't talk about, we won't go back. If he was married and she knew he was married, you actually could go after the enlisted because of the adultery, right?
Sure. But, yeah. Okay. So it seems like for fraternization, that marriage is almost like crossing the state line from the state troopers or something, right? Like if you can get to the marriage, then all of a sudden the cops wave off and they're not chasing you anymore, right? It's like a safety. It's like you're touching home base when you're playing tag, right?
Right.
Because it almost seems like the Air Force is deferring to your marital institution, that they can't go in there and meddle, right?
Yeah, basically, I mean, the Air Force and the military could want to take action. They want to try to figure out the relationship. But like you said, it just basically they're free. What's also interesting is the fraternization doesn't exist between enlisted to enlisted, right? So you'd think that the good order discipline could cover officer enlisted, officer enlisted. Like there doesn't seem to necessarily need to be a specific call out for this, because for consistency, right? Because certainly a senior non-commissioned officer and a junior enlisted, you could argue could have the same fraternization kind of construct as an officer enlisted, right? So also we should point out that not only is it a relationship, but like gambling, debt, giving loans, also, or I would, you could probably even say going into business, right? Let's say an officer enlisted wanted to open up a real estate on the side. You could absolutely, they could be in violation of UCMJ for fraternization. And I would say, probably by definition, they would be.
And I wonder, like, it makes sense because it's almost like there's this feeling of influenced by their rank, right? Like, oh, I felt I had to, or, I trusted that they would be able to take care of it because they were like a lieutenant. Now it's just a, E3 or something. But how does that differ from a E9 doing the same thing?
Right. And that's where I think that maybe that's one of those that, of course, this one probably never will be updated, right? But I think that whatever covers good order discipline and say, call it inappropriate relationship, I think that's a much better,
I agree.
That covers like the power dynamic, right? That should probably be what covers it, because again, the fraternization is so very specific, right? Because a good order discipline would be, let's say they did open a side business together, right? And there was no negative power dynamic, and it's fine, right?
So but the chief, let's say the chief master sergeant of the Air Force, not the current one, let's just say the nebulous chief master sergeant of the Air Force. Let's say they were single, and they found a Marine E3 on Tinder in Washington, D.C., and they started dating him. That would be fine.
There's nowhere do I know would that be considered inappropriate.
Right. But if a first lieutenant or what? I not even do
23, 24.
Captain like 26, 27, 28, right?
Yep.
Dates a tech sergeant in another unit, right? Let's say it's a not even medical, just because there's always some measure of contact. Let's do contracting captain and a flight line tech sergeant driving the truck. That would be against the law.
Absolutely.
And who would be punished?
The officer.
Okay.
So the medical person or the contracting.
Let's say it's contracting for the Army in a fort in Washington dating a tech sergeant in Sumter, South Carolina.
By the rules, same answer.
Can you articulate how a captain having a personal relationship with a tech sergeant in Sumter across organizations, career fields, services, can you articulate how that would affect the mission?
I can see no direct. The only from a military perspective, right, putting that hat on is saying, well, if they think it's okay to date across the services enlisted officer, what's going to prevent them from doing with their own service? But again, you can hypothetical things to death, right? And that's not how justice is supposed to work. I mean,
I would argue that you can very easily create a line of demarcation between, if you were to,
of course,
you just say no.
Of course, it goes. I think good order and discipline, which you could argue could be a bit broad, covers off on this, right? If it's someone, if they're in a relationship where they're going to like interact on a professional basis, it's good order discipline, right? You could look. There doesn't have to be anything sexual or otherwise. You can have an inappropriate if you go out to the baseball game all the time and never call the person for work related, you can always go there if you need to, but certainly clearly this one is based on tradition and tradition only.
What do you think the tradition is here?
The officer enlisted difference between, the officer enlisted, organizations within the services. I think that is the only, I'll say it's based on the traditional definition of having two different classes of people within the military.
So you think it's like a class system?
Essentially, yeah. For the non-military who listen, I know there's only probably one of them.
And who gets punished again for fraternization?
It's going to be the officer.
So is the concern that the officer is wading into the enlisted pool, or that the enlisted are coming into the officer pool?
Wow. Who knows why this one was put, right? If I have to go back in time, I'd say the enlisted coming into the officer pool.
Maybe.
Right.
Anyway,
I think that's what I would assume.
We'll move on.
What do you think?
Oh no, that's not for this podcast, Kevin.
Okay.
So now let's talk unprofessional relationships. And I think, again, we're going to find ourselves in agreement here where if I'm a chief in a unit and I start dating anyone in my unit below me, even if it's my OIC, if it's the assistant OIC, if it's a senior airman, if it's the pro super, whatever, any gender, right? I don't care. That's inappropriate. That's going to influence promotion recommendations.
And I don't think anyone has
right?
an issue with that, right? Because that clearly, especially the military power dynamic, which is very real compared to the private sector. I don't think you could put a very good argument together of why that should be allowed given the power dynamics of the military.
Is it acceptable for a CEO of a company to date a warehouse worker openly?
Well, companies have different policies, and we could just, without discussing, Bill Gates was going around looking like using Microsoft as a dating pool, right? But certainly there seems to be, many companies have rules around it, right? And CEOs over, maybe CEO may not be the best example, but I would say an executive that's not in the area of the other person, that would be allowed, right? Certainly, I would say the private sector is not going to put resources into investigating. Obviously, the Bill Gates one didn't get brought up until, you're talking the second wealthiest person in the world found that there was no investigation until the divorce came, right? And the military, absolutely. Even the two I had in our unit, we took time to investigate it, right? So that's going to be a big difference. Is that even if they have those rules in place, unless it's hand delivered platter and it's something that's going to make the news, I don't know that there was going to be a pretty big, issue. I've in my 7.5 years in the private sector, I've not run across this scenario for someone being fired for it. Yet I have multiple times where I remember this occurring in the military, right? I gave the examples as a commander. I remember happening when I was a lieutenant in my first assignment. So yeah, absolutely. That it's something that they just want to take action on.
Okay. So, like, clearly, if there is within the chain of command, either in civilian sector or in the military, if there's a relationship in your direct chain, that's not appropriate. It's not
correct,
good, right? And that very well could be the thing. Although, if you marry someone in your direct chain, the military just goes, okay, we're going to move. We're going to figure out who the easiest to move. We'll call it a day. That's the easiest way to deconflict this, right? So even unprofessional relationships can be, solved if it's early. Like one could put in for orders, or you could go to the, functional and say, is there any way that I could move, or this person could move, or whatever, as long as there's no influence to make it happen. But I guess the point I'm making is the impropriety is really narrow to the authority chain, kind of.
Right.
Which is where I can't understand the fraternization piece if it's completely outside the chain. And even in the military, if you were to disclose, hey, if it's a staff sergeant dating a master sergeant and they're in separate units, same AFSC or whatever, but they're in separate units, and then they deploy and now they're in some sort of alignment for authority, the military would know, you would be open with it and say, hey, that can't quite work. We need to have a workaround. I imagine the military would be like, okay, we'll figure it out. You'll go to phase and you'll go to this, and
they wouldn't think anything of it, right? I mean, they didn't. That I think that's the thing. That's the difference. Is we had my first fighter squadron I was in. We had two tech sergeants. They were married. One was an engine troop, and the other one, I think she's a crew chief, but she was our mobility person. Mm-hmm. They were married. Everyone knew it. It was a non-issue. Right. I think that's your point, right? That they were married was a complete. So they were in the same unit. Right? I mean, they're both tech sergeants. One wasn't a second chief, but they're both non-commissioned officers, I guess, in a position of a potential authority. Right. So but again, it's a non-issue. It truly was. Right. So I think that's the point you're trying to make, is that we make this very narrow, specific, based on traditional definitions. And we maybe not quite adapted to the world in which we are in today.
So I also want to kind of tie this back to the adultery. I don't want to do it on 2 points. First of all, there's something very strange about the military where younger people are often higher ranking. When you're talking master sergeants and lieutenants and things like that, a master sergeant's going to be 30 to 45 years old, and lieutenant's going to be, unless it's a prior E, which typically you don't run into these issues, but
not typical. Yeah.
A young lieutenant, you're looking at 21 to 25 years old. You're talking a 15 to 20 year difference. And when we're talking about the fraternization, where the officer is almost exclusively the one that's impacted, and I want to also view it through the lens of whose career is more fragile than the others. When you're talking about a young lieutenant, if they experience some sort of adverse action earlier in their career, they're sidetracked for their entire
You're absolutely
right?
Correct, right? I think that, that you get the common discussion in the military, different spanks for different ranks. We talked a little bit of other podcasts, that one thing that many enlisted don't understand, that the equivalent disciplinary action on officer is absolutely career ending, right? And a letter of reprimand is nowhere even close to career ending for enlisted. And I mean,
I got several.
And you were, by definition, had a successful career. You retired as a senior non-commissioned officer, right? Yet one letter of reprimand would be extremely detrimental. I don't think an officer could survive two. I really don't, Chris. I don't think an officer and Article 15, they're done. I mean, certainly.
Okay, so as soon as a young lieutenant engages in a relationship with an older senior NCO, fraternization, sexual, otherwise,
right?
Otherwise, there's a distinct power differential now. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Because who gets punished if it's outed?
The lieutenant, absolutely.
And they're higher ranking.
And
the senior NCO is lower ranking, older than this younger person, and you've completely discombobulated the power structure.
Right.
And the only reason you discombobulated the power structure is because fraternization exists as a punishment where it focuses highly on the officer.
And what's interesting in that scenario you gave out is when I was, I guess, got a little more senior, so like a captain and certainly as a major, that I would tell the young maintenance lieutenants, say, if you go TDY, hang out with the senior NCOs, right? Which is ironic given that's the scenario you give, right? Because I felt that, part was because in general that, one, senior NCOs were usually calmer, right? And I actually had, that's true. Like they would, they'd go to dinner and they were often married and they would, go eat and then they'd go back to their rooms and be good, right? I'd tell lieutenants, you need to be bored on TDY. Yep. Just go to, and certainly I had an incident when I was a captain where one of the lieutenants who worked for me in Singapore, deployed to Singapore, I was in Osan, and decided to rage with the youngins, right? I think the highest person there was, maybe one or two techs. The senior NCOs were all in bed for the night, and bad things happen, right? But certainly that example you gave is, she was the one who had the most scrutiny, even though, without going into details, that she in many ways was the potential victim in this circumstance, because she was the officer and you had the fraternization cloud hanging over. It was almost like that became a rationalization to not take her word about the potential assault that occurred, right? Just based on the whole concept of fraternization, right? So you could argue that power dynamic that existed. Again, I wasn't there. I was 2,000 miles away. I have no idea. When people drink alcohol and dress in togas and weird things ensue, who knows what went on? Right. But certainly that the whole and the discussion became, does she get charged with fraternization? Ironically, she was, at least in the court-martial proceedings, the victim. Right. Which the enlisted person involved wasn't convicted in this case, but because the lieutenant had PCS'd, I think that's why the commander chose not to take action. I believe if she had stayed in the unit, she very well may have been tried, or not tried. I don't think it would have gone to court. I think it would have been Article 15. You very well could have viewed as the potential victim because of the fraternization could have had a career-ending action taken against.
Does that sound like a good system?
Given where we are in 2021, you can see the potential abuse for it. No, it seems like that's because you've talked a lot about the power dynamic, and that, we know abuse occurs when there's a misbalance in power dynamic, which I don't think 15 or 20 years ago we understood like we do today, the power dynamic and the discussions in that area. So, basically, I have no reason to not believe the lieutenant what she said happened to her. But I told her when she came up to me, I said, what was the first thing I told you when you go TDY? She said, hang out with the senior NCOs. I said, absolutely.
That sounds a lot like you shouldn't dress slutty.
It does.
And I'm not making that argument clearly.
No.
But it's like, if you weren't fraternizing with these enlisted people, you may not have been sexually assaulted, and then you still did it. So therefore, we're also going to punish you for this. Or any number of things. That's a pretty, and it is really, I think it happens more than people realize. And I think a lot of it is propped up by the fraternization structure that we have now.
Right. And you talk about, take the rank and the authority piece out, right? It's the lieutenants and the airmen are going to be the same age, right? Certainly it's an interesting dynamic, right? You put especially the younger officers, in an interesting situation where there's, only a few of them, in a unit, right? And you somewhat don't allow them to have a peer group, right? It's very limited. So, it does create an interesting dynamic where you can, when, if you're on the road for a month or two, I'm talking just completely appropriate. So, hey, let's go to a movie, right? I'm talking completely, everyone's paying on their own, right? But that could, you do it enough times, that could become a problem when there is no intended issue behind it, because the age differential, what we want to do day to day is different. But yeah, is a very interesting power, and there's no doubt that if you wanted to get an officer in trouble, and I think that it doesn't happen very often, because I think most people, they don't want to get people in trouble, right? But you absolutely could, if you're enlisted, wanted to make an issue of something and use fraternization, an officer could be in really deep trouble really quick. I don't know the burden of proof would be that high, by the way.
Well, a lot of times fraternization is just even the perception of favoritism.
It is. Well. And we had one incident happen in our squadron around that. It was a perception. I don't believe the lieutenant had actually done anything that was inappropriate, but interesting how these things tie together. One of the airmen in our unit was married to an airman in the OSS, right? And it was the wife made the issue of the potential of fraternization, right? And there was pictures involved too, right? So that really put me in a bind, because I don't believe the lieutenant had done anything, let's say like gambling or adultery or those kind of things. I literally think they all just had gone together in a group, and they had all been drinking, and the married spouse of the airman in my unit made an issue of it. Now, did I take any action on him because he was married? No, because I don't think anything occurred. Right, absolutely. I don't think anything had occurred. But the lieutenant, it was a little bit different scenario.
I wonder how many sexual assaults don't get reported because there was fraternization or perceived fraternization leading up to it that now creates this weird dynamic. And luckily I have a really good friend that's a sapper expert, so I'm going to hit her up after this and just ask the question if there's any sort of immunity from fraternization.
My guess would be no. Process. I don't know, but
man, that's going to piss me the fuck off if the answer is
no. Because I would guess the answer is no. I could be totally wrong.
And then there's also a difference between prosecuting for fraternization, it'd be like being immune from that, but there still could be career impacts from, like the scenario is, a young officer gets involved with an enlisted person where it's fraternization-esque because of whatever reasons, and then the sexual assault happens. If she goes to sapper and there is some I fucking hope there's some immunity. There should be. That should be. And I'm really hoping. I call up my friend and they go, "Oh, of course, this couldn't work if." And I'm like, I'm hoping.
I would be surprised if there's some level.
I know you hope you're wrong too.
I do.
You don't think you're wrong.
I don't think I'm wrong. I don't think I'm wrong because, look, it's, if I recall correctly, we could discipline people for trying to commit suicide.
Yeah, that's in there too. I was actually I don't think we're going to get to this episode.
Am I correct in that, Chris?
Yeah, you are.
Yeah. So I think
and it's specifically, there's specific verbiage on it of if you're not trying to get out of something, so it would fall under like a malingering sort of category. So it's almost independent of, if you just want to end your life, this is the UCMJ article for killing yourself that will prosecute you if you don't succeed. Right.
So that's, I mean, so this one probably, yeah. So you tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm going to guess I'm not wrong. There's no immunity unless they report what the one where there's two different categories. At least there used to be.
Yeah, restricted, unrestricted.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure restricted there would be because that's not releasable information to your command. I would like to think an unrestricted sapper report, SARC, whatever it's called now. Sorry, I'm too far gone as a retiree to know the right acronym, but the sexual assault prevention stuff. If it's an unrestricted report and your command gets notified, there should absolutely be, and it, you know what? I'll tell you what.
They may not take action. I agree with you, they'll not take action, but I'm saying I don't believe it's written as a immunity.
And I'll tell you what, if it was written, I feel like I would know it because it would have gone into a fucking briefing.
Yeah.
I feel like they would have said, hey, this is the way the system's set up. So I'm probably leaning more towards you being right, but I'm still hoping in my heart that you're wrong. But and then the second effect is, like, let's say there is immunity to fraternization. That still doesn't mean your commander doesn't know that you engaged in this behavior. And maybe you're going to get rack and stack lower for your year group and all these things, that really subtle sort of action, because you've exposed you have a poor character in such a way. And everyone knows that's how it works. And that's also going to make people not want to report sexual assault,
right?
Harassment.
You're absolutely right, because you could even say if under the scenario of assault, that specific incident itself would have immunity. Like, I'm going to guess it doesn't. The events that led up, there's no way those would have immunity.
They have to have immunity.
Yeah, I bet they would say, they could, again, whether someone would do it or not, I don't know, but they absolutely could say that the relationship started 6 months ago. We're taking action based on that 6 months ago, not the incident.
And that's a good point, because you're saying it depends on if it would be prosecuted or not. And that's where the commander needs to step in during their initial conversation with their young officers and lay it out. Hey, if there's any sort of issues here, I would not press fraternization at all whatsoever. If there was later, of course, now I worry that then if somebody gets caught fraternizing, they could claim sexual assault and wash it all away. And
right. Commanders.
Also, if you get rid of fraternization fucking completely, it solves this. I like to point that out. But yeah,
and what's interesting is, and we've, for those again who aren't as familiar, commanders have a lot of latitude not to, charge people with things, as you talked earlier, but especially large organizations, I like to be consistent, right? And I know the one we haven't talked about, we're not going to necessarily go into it. The one that was the military with the civilian, and the military was married, so not in the same chain of command. I disciplined him. It was no contact. It was simply based on the concept of, it's in the UCMJ. I know, and if I allow something to go on that is not allowed, then I'm setting the unit up for some level of a problem. It was not based on, now, did I think what again, we're not talking morality. Did I think what he was doing was right? No, I completely disagree. But the reason I took action was based on, I wanted to make sure we had good order and discipline, and I didn't want to be perceived as having, favorites, right?
So if there was no adultery article, you wouldn't have done anything.
No.
So you only took action because it was written on paper, and you as a commander were tasked with enforcing those laws. And if you picked and choose which laws you would enforce, then you would expect to see some degradation of compliance all over the place, because people wouldn't know what the standard was.
Right. I literally, Chris, I still remember when I was with him, essentially begging him. He told me he loved both. I remember in my office, I said, you need to pick. I said, do not get into more trouble for this. He was otherwise a good performer, right? So yeah, I took action because of that specifically.
So you're saying otherwise he was a good performer, which means he helped make the mission happen, good leader, took care of his people, was a competent technical expert.
Yes.
And the only thing that he was deficient in was he engaged in an extramarital affair.
That's correct. And again, like I mentioned earlier, it was a no contact order. I mean, here's the thing. He even brought to us his contact after the no contact order because he didn't want to lie about it.
He sounds like a really honest, upstanding person.
Right. I mean, I guess outside of the affair.
Right. Okay.
Right.
So the last thing I want to talk about is sodomy. I figure I just put it out there real bold so we can get to it. And I'm gonna read it from the UCMJ. This was changed only in 2019, but up until then it was still on the books. So Article 125 is any person subject to this chapter, which is a military member, who engages in unnatural carnal copulation with another person of the same or opposite sex. And there's animal stuff, and clearly bestiality is, I feel, an appropriate, like I'm not going to wade into that because that feels like an animal abuse thing. And yeah, that's fine. It says penetration, however slight, is sufficient to complete the offense. It further explains what unnatural carnal copulation is: for a person to take into that person's mouth or anus the sexual organ of another person, or to place that person's sexual organ in the mouth or anus of another person. Or to have any carnal copulation with any opening of the body except for the sexual parts with another person. So, can you explain to me, Kevin, how your airmen engaging in oral or anal sex negatively impacted their performance at work or their leadership or their honesty or them paying their bills or their technical expertise?
I'm going to say I never had one of these cases go through. I'm going to assume that it was occurring. So I'm going to say the answer is 0, right? In fact, I think all this ever brought up was this, you could argue, could have given people more of a negative perception of the UCMJ. They're like, why is that in there? Right? Because
I think we know why it's in there, right?
We do know why it's in there, right? It was likely to keep people out that were gay from the military, right? I'm sure that is why it got in there. What's funny is more people seem to know about that one UCMJ, and how many people said this is crazy, right? And this is one of those interesting dynamics when you put things in laws or rules, and UCMJ's law that's so ridiculous, it actually makes people question everything. Like, why is that in there? Right? I mean, and we all know that's, it's very, it's what do you say? You don't want you don't want good people to get in trouble for bad rules, right? And that's the silly thing. Again, how often was you? I can't ever imagine. Again, most of my time was spent under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I mean, my cadet years were spent under before, but certainly under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the sodomy could have been used as a reason to discharge someone who is a homosexual, right? Certainly that for sure. But that one, there's maybe someone out there smarter than me that can tell me how that would have been used in a heterosexual scenario to discipline someone. I can only imagine it being used.
Kevin, I'm going to use your own words against you. I'm going to use your own words against you here. So you said not 5 minutes ago, talking about the guy that committed adultery, that he was otherwise a great dude.
Yeah, there you go.
And you only did it because you didn't agree that it mattered, but it was written in the UCMJ, so you couldn't not prosecute or not push the Article 15 for adultery because you would be concerned that if you didn't push that one, the standard would start to get wild and you lose good order and discipline. So my question to you is, under that same framework, if you were presented with video evidence of one of your members engaging in sodomy in some way with a consenting adult, something that millions and billions of people do probably every day, would you have pushed an Article 15?
And this is, you're going to get me in one of the inconsistencies. I probably would not have.
So
right?
that was beyond the threshold. You're like, this is just
right. Whatever threshold I had set as a command. No, I'm sure I wouldn't have. I can tell you, there's, all seriously, there's no way. Because I definitely had. It was interesting. I had two people come to me who confessed to being homosexual. Right when I was a commander, and
this was under Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Right, and I asked both of them basically, do they have to act out on their feelings? And one was getting ready to get out. He said he was good. Now, I'm sure he still acted out, but he had told me he was good, so I let it go. The other one had told me that, this is who he was. I said, do you understand that by saying this is how you want to live your life, that, basically my hands are tied? He said, sir, I understand. Right. So, I guess what I was saying to them, are they sure they wanted to tell me they were self-reporting under Don't Ask, Don't Tell? I was giving them. So I guess, in that scenario, Chris, I was telling you, I was going to give them an opportunity to say, we can go back to not asking or telling. But if you confirm what you told me, then we've kind of crossed over. But clearly on the sodomy, there's no way. Now, would I probably told them like they need to be careful? Like, is it smart to film yourself doing stuff? Forget the UCMJ aspect. Like, is it certainly would have probably told them all of those things, a healthy relationship and all that. But I was said, just, no, I wouldn't have done anything on that.
So, I think first of all, it's really interesting that they call oral and anal sex an unnatural carnal copulation. So cooked into the UCMJ, there's an immediate value judgment on anyone that engages in it, right? It's called
Right.
unnatural. And then it's also viewing it as it's some sort of obscene or, this terrible act. But I think the reality is, and, I'm stepping out on a limb here because I'm not gay, but I think the reality is what they're describing as an unnatural carnal copulation is an expression of love from one person to another. Yeah, certainly you go into port and you meet somebody and you're meeting a physiological want and need for sexual attention, but there's also deep relationships that form that include engaging in these behaviors and these acts between heterosexual and homosexual people, right? But what it is it's codifying that expressing your love to your person is a crime.
Right.
It's literally saying how you express your love is unnatural. And I'm grasping at straws to figure out why the fuck the Air Force, military in general, is going to tell me what is an acceptable way for me to express love, because that goes back to adultery. How I define love with my spouse is between me and them, and that's it. And the Air Force should not weigh in on if our marriage meets their moral standard. It's just not okay.
And I think this one is significantly again, you want to put them in good or bad, right? That this one is completely undefendable, and it was a reason to discriminate against people, right? I think maybe probably the term unnatural was put on purpose, right? And
it goes back to the military and military service. It permeates your entire life. When we talked about when you had your go bag and you were deploying, how you had no control and you're waiting for 2 weeks for the word go, you get moved, you get called in, you have to have good credit in order to maintain security clearance. Your leave it's all you're so tightly wound that it's like at some point you need to have your space to exist and be yourself. And it seems like these issues in particular really extended the tendrils of control into your lives. I mean, we're talking about entering the bedroom and entering the heart of what you feel for another person, how you express that, and basically placing you as, your expression of love is an unnatural carnal copulation, or your contract for your spouse is not okay by military standards. And I think a lot of these articles, much like you talked about, even though you tried to maintain consistency, I think you found that you even have a limit to where you would no longer push a UCMJ action for some of these. And I think your adultery limit is probably further than a lot of, maybe not a lot, but some commanders would go, because they'd be like, I kind of don't care unless it creeps into mission. But what it does is it creates these shifting sort of standards from unit to unit and base to base and culture to culture. And it keeps people that are in open marriages that do make really good friends with officers that are other service. It keeps them always in a feeling of they're off balance a little bit professionally, but they also, it signals to them that you are not good because we've written down specifically that you're not good.
Yeah, it's, the thing is you mentioned about the control, right? And I think that a lot of again, it goes down to the military needs to have real discussion on where does image play. We talked about this. We talked about PT, right? Mm-hmm. And deciding how much control you need to have in people's lives, because they already have a ton. Like you said, explain to people, having a go bag underneath your desk at work. I think if I talk to people, people come to my office, I keep one there in case there's an earthquake, right? They think that's like crazy, right? But it's funny how that gets so ingrained in your thinking. You can't even literally there's habits I have, I'm sure the habits you have, they're so ingrained in you, right? I mean, you can't change them. And I think the military have a really strong, hard look about where do we go on the military image. And I don't know that, that they're going to have that conversation, right? I think that you've seen recently about some of the issues with the special forces about being allowed to kind of get out of control, right? Yep. Where, there was a lot of looking the other way because of their skill set and the need for Iraq and Afghanistan, right? So, but there's got to be a balance, right? Of saying these things are acceptable behaviors, and this is how they specifically impact the mission.
Yeah.
These do not impact the mission, and get rid of those. Or and just land on the things that really impact the mission.
You can't lean on good order and discipline. If you can objectively show how this behavior led to mission detriment, you can capture under you violated, you're falling under the general article now. You violated good order and discipline. There's so much commander discretion. It's probably the barrier is really low if you can show any sort of objective harm or even perceptions of harm, and that's it.
Right. Chris, certainly people, the legal side could argue in the military, well, if it's not specific, if it ever goes to a court martial, a good defense attorney could overcome. Well, one, our system is set up that someone's innocent until proven guilty. Two, you and I both know that the number of UCMJ violations go to court martial is tiny. And the ones that go there in general are going to be ones that you're still going to have codified, written down, right? Assault or clearly, abusing your position are going to be there. I mean, you're not, you're not, look, these I talked about did not go to a court martial.
Right.
Never even occurred to me that I'd want to go that far. And by the way, I don't think it occurred to either of the people involved to go that far.
What if they rejected it and said, no, let's go to court martial? Would you have?
So the answer is yes, because I think legal drills into you. If you say this is what you're going to do, you need to be prepared to do that, right? And as a commander, you don't want to threaten, because you don't want to be the person that threatens, right? Either you're going to do it, and I would always use, so that discussion for a commander and their shirt should come before you go to that. You should say, if you're not willing to go to a court martial, then drop it down to an LOR or LOC or verbal, whatever you want. But don't say, well, this is really a reprimand, but I'm going to give him UCJ because I want to stick it to him. Well, that's the commander not being a commander. You've got to do things that you can prove, and that you feel in your heart have a negative impact to good order discipline, to the unit, right? You can't just say, well, I think they won't fight me, so I'm going to, hammer them.
Yep. Okay. Well, I think we're running out of time, but I guess we'll do a quick scorecard. Do you think adultery should be a UCMJ offense?
I do not.
What do you think about fraternization outside of the unprofessional relationship scenario?
I would do one of two things, right?
Okay.
I would either put it under the unprofessional, or I would add, ironically, or I'd add enlisted in also.
Okay.
Kind of like where our forces today, the responsibility many enlisted have. If we think it's a good order discipline thing and needs its own call out, then let's put enlisted in there, even if you want to call it senior instrument. So I think we need to be consistent in the fraternization, or we need to handle it as a insubordinate, inappropriate relationship, good order discipline.
Okay.
That's how I would do it.
All right. Well, do you have any final thoughts?
It's interesting. So no, this was, I'll tell you, compared to the other ones we've done, a little more of a challenge, right? Because these are ones that are really, you having to go with what the perception of the military is supposed to be as a commander's role and good order discipline, what's fair to the force, and what we, and the military putting a definition of morality that certainly killing someone who doesn't deserve to be killed, we know where that hits on the moral. But these are ones that are very much more opinion. Even you talked about, the scenario you laid out with infidelity, right? Like if they're an open relationship, is that the place for the military to make a moral equation on, right? And so I think, again, it's the image of morality that the military needs to have in today's environment. And this is not one of those, discussions on, well, is this going to make the Russians better us than
right?
That's a different one. I mean, I certainly believe that that you can have these discussions of what's allowed and not allowed, and none of these things would negatively impact the force at all.
So you think it's an image issue?
I think it's image / a definition of morality, which probably flows in image. So yeah, I guess the root cause image.
That's good. So the image I'm seeing from these three is you have to be in a monogamous married relationship, heterosexual. You cannot engage in any sort of homosexual acts, and the officer pool will not sully themselves with the enlisted pool.
Yes.
All right. Well, thanks, Kevin. I appreciate it, as always. And be on the lookout for an episode coming up soon where we're going to dive into a topic that's tangentially related to this that I'm going to surprise Kevin with. Other than that, Kevin, thank you for the time, and adios.